Hi, everyone. I'm Iain MacGregor, as I was just introduced. What we thought we'd do today is obviously, we're only here for an hour, so there's only so much we can talk about. And obviously, you've got three great books in front of you and three authors that came to the story of Berlin from completely different angles. So what we thought would be a nice opportunity is we just talk about our respective books, but obviously just give you vignettes of certain aspects of Berlin, the city, the evolution of Berlin, how the city progressed through the 20th century, past obviously the First and Second World War. Then you go into the Cold War. That will be Barney's kind of section of the talk. And then we'll talk about obviously Cold War Berlin, how the sectors came around, how the fight for the city during the Cold War politically was fought, and the rise of the Berlin Wall. And then obviously we can approach about what life was like for the British garrison. Obviously there was Allied garrisons there, but we'll focus on the British garrison today. And Peter will talk about what life was like for the garrison there in Berlin. And then we'll close it by obviously talking about 1989 and the opening of the checkpoints and the subsequent fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'll end with just a nice anecdote about the commandant of the British sector, Sir Robert Corbett, which I talk about in my book, Checkpoint Charlie. So to begin with, and we drew straws, and that's why I'm speaking, by the way. So what we thought we'd talk about first is we've got themes, and the first theme is imagining Berlin. So Barney wants to talk about the foundation of the city and how it actually became the capital of Germany.
So thanks, Ian, very much indeed. So I think with Berlin, fairly obviously, we tend to focus on the 20th century. But the Germans do get a bit sensitive about that, because they do say we had a history before 1933, before 1914. And what's so interesting and attractive to me is that the characteristics that come to define Berlin in the Cold War are characteristics which have been there since medieval times. So Berlin is not a natural capital. It was twin fishing villages on the River Spree. The Spree is a rather idle river when you compare it to the Oder or the Elbe or something like that. I mean, it's a stream. But it was a convenient place to wharf boats, and there were lots of fish in the Spree. And gradually, it became not only fishing villages, but a trading entrepot, where the trade routes from North and South Europe and East and West crossed. What that gave it was an immigrant population. So they weren't Brandenburgs. It would become the capital of Brandenburg long before the capital of Prussia or the capital of Germany. But because it had this immigrant population, it also developed its own sort of peculiar character, its own spirit, what the Berliners like calling Berlin und Wille, which literally means Bolshevik Berlin, if you like. And it's never been, ever since then, it's never really been a German city. It's always been its own entity. It's had its own character, its own feel. And although it had obviously became the capital, it's always resented authority. Berliners have revolted 5 times in their history. And when we come on to 53, you'll realise that's just one in a long stream. 1447, 1918. They actually nearly had one in 1618 as well, when the Hohenzollerns tried to make them Calvinist, which understandably they didn't like. Then, of course, 1953, and it wasn't until 1989 when they had a peaceful revolution, actually, but they were successful. The wits would tell you that Berlin isn't actually a German city at all, because it's actually built on the glacial scree from Scandinavia, which Berliners say is why they're different. But really why it really comes into its own, and again, you have to look back to this to really understand what happens in the 20th century, is the Hohenzollerns, who buy the mark of Brandenburg from the Habsburg emperors, actually make it their capital. And because of that, it's why it becomes eventually, well, the capital of Brandenburg, then the capital of Prussia, and then finally the capital of the German Empire. And you cannot divorce the story of Berlin from the story of the Hohenzollerns right up until 1918, when the most disastrous of that previously illustrious and very successful dynasty disappears on his royal train to Holland and doesn't come back. The great events that happen, the 30 Years' War, something which we all neglect. Now, even though in school we were always asked to write whether it was a war of religion or not. The 30 Years' War had a huge impact on Berlin and Brandenburg, and Berlin was destroyed. And it gave Germany this sense of victimhood, which persisted. And again, when we're now looking at the origins of what happened in the 20th century, you have to bear that in mind. So even the great German authors, people like Schiller, actually couldn't sort of write about Germany without writing a long essay on the 30 Years' War and how unfair it had been to Germany, how Germany had suffered, and how Berlin had suffered in particular. And then we go on to the great Hohenzollern rulers, Frederick William I, probably the greatest and the most misunderstood, Frederick the Great, probably greatly overemphasized. And then we have Berlin becoming the center, while Frederick sort of maintains an absolutist court. At Sanssouci in Potsdam, Berlin becomes the center, first of all, of German nationalism, actually saying, we were going to create the German nation. And then it becomes the industrial center of Germany. And during the 19th century, it becomes the largest city in Europe, the fastest growing city in Europe, and one with the worst social conditions. It becomes an increasingly left-wing city. Marx actually researched the Communist Manifesto from being at the university in Berlin. And so as we come through that disastrous First World War into the 1920s, we have a city where all these different themes, these different sort of issues are running. And we have this terrible period in the 1920s. And people say, well, the 1920s is a marvelous time in Berlin, so exciting, sort of cabaret era. Yeah, but if you're an average Berliner, it was simply terrible. You'd lost large parts of your family in the First World War. There was stagflation. Then you had the recession. You lost your job. And so as the Nazis come, they start to play, as they develop their power base, they play on this German nationalism. They play on being in opposition to the very strong left movement that's developed in Berlin. They restore some sense of, to a lot of Germans, some sense of dignity, if you like, to what's been a fairly terrible period. And then we go into those terrible days of the Second World War and those twin persecutions from bombing and then the Soviet invasion. Let me shut that and then we can come back on them later.
We're just having a few issues with the presentation, but it's going to come online very soon. But the one thing I was going to ask you, though, was what elevated Berlin compared to other German cities in terms of immigration and culture?
I think because of where it is, and if you think of Berlin, it's in a fairly unique geographical position. It's very far east. It's now almost on the German-Polish border. It's within a sort of 30 miles. Because you got the waves of people coming from what was then Prussia, which wasn't part of Berlin, wasn't part of, obviously, from Königsberg, from Russia, and also particularly from the Hanseatic League ports. Mm-hmm. And then you had the other route, that was the route from the east. Then you had the western route, which was down the Elbe from Hamburg, also in the Hanseatic League. So you had a sort of a melting pot. I guess also it's because you did have this old Wendish culture in Berlin, which is fascinating. I don't want to distract you too much. It's a long way from the Cold War. But actually Wendish, as an old-fashioned language, was spoken in the area around Berlin right up until the 1930s, when the Nazis, who despised anything so Slavic, should be in there and should be near them, finish off the last Wendish communities. But it's had since the earliest time, so I wanted to write that. It's had this tolerance, this idea of actually, they always say there's no such thing as a typical Berliner. A typical Berliner is somebody who's just arrived at the railway station. And it's completely true. You go to any other European city, you feel like a tourist. You go to Berlin, you feel immediately that you belong there.
True.
It never judges you, Berlin, like that.
Well, I was also going to, because you talk about it, because I have to admit, I commissioned Barney to write Berlin. So
I've very good judgment.
I've got a horse in this race, and that's why I can ask him questions about the book. But when we talk about the significance of the Brandenburg Gate, so that's obviously a key monument during the Cold War. It's in the British sector, but describe to those who don't know in the audience what the significance was to the Germans.
Yes, so the Brandenburg Gate actually was Berlin's had lots of walls in its life, and Frederick William I, Frederick the Great's father, who he often portrayed as a madman, but actually was rather a forward-thinking monarch, in my opinion. He built a customs wall around centre of Berlin. So all the tours, the gates in Berlin, don't refer to anything other than the gates in the customs hall. The Brandenburg Gate was the gate on the end of Unter den Linden, the sort of, if you like, Mall equivalent, that led out to Brandenburg. It was originally a sort of fairly ordinary affair, but then in the 1790s was this beginnings of sort of beautifying Berlin. And what's so interesting about the Brandenburg Gate, apart from the fact that it is actually the most, I think, sort of one of the most perfectly formed buildings, if we can call it a building, in Europe. It is the most beautiful structure. It did two things. It was, first of all, almost a reaction against the sort of Frederick the Great, French, fussy, rococo, over-the-top, sans souci sort of Potsdam society that he wanted to create. And it was also showed the very sort of strong classical influence that was coming into Germany. And why it's so important is because it is almost a statement of the beginning of the German Enlightenment. It's the beginning of German nationalism, of the Romantic movement. And so you've got two things. You've got this incredibly striking, I'm sure most of you have seen it, but it is the most, you can sit and look at the Brandenburg Gate for hours and hours. And yet at the same time it's symbolic of a Germany that's changing.
I was just going to ask, could I have a show of hands? Who's been to Berlin? Just so.
That's wonderful.
That's what we see. So it helps when we're talking about things that you'll know about it.
We will have a side of it. It's on the front of my book. So.
Yeah. We sent in 2 presentations today, and I think we're fixing it anyway. But it's us you want to hear, I would imagine. And what was the significance about the chariot on the top of the Brandenburg Gate?
The quadriga, yeah, the goddess of victory, which is the poor goddess who's been through many vicissitudes in her life. She's been a symbol of war. She's been a symbol of peace. She's been changed round, so she looked into Berlin, so she was being seen to come into the city. She was being seen to face outwards, so she was defending it. She was nicked by Napoleon because she became such a such a famous symbol of the city. Napoleon dismantled her and her horses and took them all off to Paris. Napoleon did that quite a lot, as you probably know. And she was restored after Napoleon was defeated. The huge debates always went on about what was on her staff. If you look at the top there, and you can see the staff, well, that staff has changed more in the history of Berlin than almost anything else.
I was going to ask you about it. There is a legend that the East Germans turned the chariot around.
Yes, it was originally, that is true, but it was originally designed to face out. And originally, there's been debate, should she have an iron cross in the top of her staff? Which she did, Schinkel's great Iron Cross, which was the Iron Cross was designed as an award during the Napoleonic Wars for the defence of Germany, defence of Berlin. It's nothing to do with the Nazis or the later Kaisers. Should you have a Prussian eagle? Of course, the East Germans said, no, because we're so peaceful, we can't possibly have an Iron Cross. It's a symbol of Prussian militarism. But as the East Germans began to suddenly realise that it was setting itself as the capital of what had been Prussia, actually history is quite a useful thing for a nation to have. So, and when it was pointed out to Ulbricht that actually Schinkel had designed the Iron Cross for the defence of the people, it was changed. So anyway, and then she was taken down in the Second World War. There was a plaster cast made of her. And there was this extraordinary compromise during the Cold War when the East Germany was responsible for the gate itself, because it was actually just in East Germany. The wall came right in front of it, as many of you probably remember. But West Germany was responsible for the quadriga. So there was one of those wonderful it's one of the few areas where two sides actually cooperated on quid pro quo.
So we skipped through the evolution of Berlin, but what we can talk about now is how did and we'll go straight into the Cold War, but what was how did the Nazis hold Berlin?
The Nazis never liked, but it's to Berlin's great credit that Berlin's one of the least Nazi cities in Europe. Berlin's never liked its rulers, or its rulers never liked Berlin, so the Hohenzollerns all built themselves agreeable palaces outside places like Potsdam. But the purpose of those rallies was to get them outside Berlin, because there's always been this sort of left-wing, anti-establishment feeling in Berlin, which I pointed out. The Goebbels was sent by the Nazis in the late 1920s, 1928, I think, to try and get the Nazi Party going in Berlin. But it took a long time, and it was actually much stronger in the suburbs, fun enough, than it ever was in the centre. The centre has always been much more left-leaning. And Hitler really never forgave the Berliners for not supporting him overwhelmingly in the elections, particularly in 1933. When Berlin, although there was a sizable Nazi vote, Berlin did not give him the endorsement that he wanted. And ever since then, he hated it. He thought it was a scruffy city. He said it wasn't good enough to be the capital of this great Reich that was going to last 1,000 years. He'd set to redesign it. Okay. And we have this great project of Germania. That sounds good. Yeah, do. Sorry. Yeah, certainly. Is that all right? He had this great project called Germania when they were going to literally rebuild the place. They were going to demolish a few insignificant buildings on the way. And there was a huge avenue that was going to run from Tempelhof right up to the north. There was going to be a massive arch, which was going to commemorate every German who'd been killed in the First World War, except for any Jews whose names weren't going to appear. And it was a most vulgar, and then yes, there was a great hall of the people again, sort of going to be at the far end, which was going to massively dwarf anything else. I mean, it would have sort of been visible for 50 miles away, but thank God it was never built. And actually, I often wonder how serious the Nazis were about it, because their spiritual home was not there. It was in Bavaria. It was in Nuremberg, which is where they had those rallies, and they went there because there they could be. That's where the Hohenzollerns came from. It's where they could depend on large cheering crowds saying loyal things about Hitler. There's a famous incident when the declaration of war with Poland, Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, when Hitler drove from a chancellery in Wilhelmstrasse, which is now a Chinese takeaway, or the site of it is, he went out to the Olympic Stadium to make a great speech, which was all packed with the army, so that was fine. But coming back in, he was met with stony silence as he drove up beyond Den Linden and then down Friedrichstrasse. And he never really got over that. So instead of these great cheers he expected, he got this sort of awful quiet. And he spent very little time in Berlin after that. So the Chancellery was really, of the 1930s era. He was otherwise in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia or down in Bavaria. So Nazis in Berlin was a miss. Much to Berlin's credit, I have to say.
So as we see with the next slide, we're now at the end of the war, kind of May 1945.
Indeed.
And the city had obviously been stormed.
The city was, Berlin's fairly normal up until about 1942. And interestingly, it's Stalingrad that really turns the mood. And the Nazis go from trying to make it a place which is as normal as possible, the capital of the Reich, where you can go to the theatre. But Goebbels realizes that after Stalingrad, they have to change their tune. And it becomes a much more oppressive, difficult city. It was a complete blackout. It hadn't actually been bombed much by then. There'd been a few rather feeble British raids, which had but they hadn't actually done much damage. They were really almost Churchill trying to get it, he was so infuriated by Goering saying no British bomber would ever get through that a rather large cost.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, by the end of the war, 70% of Berlin in a 5-mile radius from the centre had been destroyed. So that shows you that's not just Allied bombing, that's obviously what the Soviets did as well as they were coming through. And the
Soviets don't do strategic bombing, obviously, they do tactical bombing. So it was tactical air forces. But between 42 and 45, actually some of the worst Allied raids were between Christmas and April 1945, and that's when Potsdam was flattened. And the destruction is fairly horrible. And again, in the book, and I'm sure Peter will too, I've described what it was like for living in the shelters. There was a very moving bit about a group of schoolgirls who were asked to write an essay after the war about what it had been like living through a bombing raid. And all this you hear about bombing wasn't effective. It didn't have any effect. It's absolute rubbish. I mean, it really did have a huge psychological and physical impact. Yeah. So by April 45, you've got the city very badly bombed, no running water, no utilities, very little to eat, no coal, which is things always bothered people. So you can't, it's quite cold Berlin in the winter. And then you have the April 45.
I was just going to say there's a very interesting anecdote for those of you who don't know to this photo. So obviously this was staged after they'd stormed the Reichstag, and they set up they sent in a new unit, specially chosen by Zhukov to be the guys who were going to raise the flag. They didn't actually have a flag big enough, so they had to get a designer to go and grab a huge red tablecloth and design the flag. And then once the photo had been taken, the Russian officer you can see just almost out of shot holding on to the soldier's leg, he was actually wearing about 4 watches on his wrist. And again, that photo had to be doctored by the propaganda wing of the Red Army to show that Russian soldiers weren't looting Germany. So that's one of the
and you can still see in Berlin the approach routes of the various shock armies as they came in. The armies chose a major thoroughfare as their axis and simply went roughly 500 yards, 500 meters either side of it, and just drove through, destroying everything in their wake. And you can still follow it now by looking at the building. And actually out in East Berlin, you can still see once you get out beyond the real centre of modern East Berlin that so many of the buildings still covered in bullet marks and shell damage.
Well, thank you, Barney.
So, not at all. Shall I hand this over?
Yes, give it to Peter.
Are these things working now?
No, just Barney. It's always just Barney.
Sorry.
I apologise for Barney. So yeah, there you go. It's always my fault. You need to keep that. So I just put in one slide just to show you when we were talking about the damage to various streets. And this is obviously once the Germans themselves have been put to work to tidy up the streets once the declaration of surrender had been signed. And you've got the Trümmerfrau coming in to make sure they could start cleaning up the main thoroughfares. But as I said, 70% of the city had been destroyed in a 5-mile radius. Huge, huge damage. So now Peter will talk about how we came about to have the Berlin sector itself from the Allies meeting after the war.
Yeah, thank you. And this is obviously very interesting because this builds on what Barney has just been talking about, which is, Berlin itself, deep inside what became Soviet territory. Obviously, before the borders were redrawn, it was actually much deeper inside Germany itself. The borders of Poland are extended several hundred kilometres westwards in the aftermath of the war. But Berlin itself, for all the reasons that Barney just described, didn't have any great strategic value. It was highly symbolic. Obviously, it's where the war, victory needed to be delivered. But for the Americans and for the British, the war actually ended several hundred kilometres away. And it was the Red Army that took Berlin. And then the British only advance into Berlin was sort of with the permission of the Red Army as well. And quickly, that you can see from that symbolic value, but you also see the ideological tensions that existed between the 3 leaders. You can see there 2 of those were swiftly to well, that's Truman, isn't it? So Truman's obviously already replaced Roosevelt, and then Churchill himself loses the election in 1945 and is replaced by Attlee. And all of this rapid period of change, you can see that whilst the war itself may have ended, essentially the frictions are just beginning to emerge that sets up the new confrontation. The dominant and enduring force in that is Stalin and what Stalin wants. And Stalin obviously wants to create a buffer zone between himself and the West, for which Germany, Poland, and several other countries are pretty much perfect. But also he wants to extend his sphere of influence and drive it as far westward as he can. And so pretty soon the Allies are presented with a choice, which is, well, we're going to divide Germany into zones of occupation. Well, we better do this with Berlin as well. Sort of as we can't just let the former capital of Germany entirely go under the Soviet influence. And so the plans for the division of Germany, which had been discussed at Yalta and then were confirmed at Potsdam, are extended to Berlin as well. And it's useful to look at the map of Berlin and the map of divided Germany there. The saying always was, in the division of Germany, the Americans got the scenery, the French got the wine, and the British got the ruins. And that's very much true. And then obviously then they extend this into Berlin itself and division of Berlin. But you can see there, very deep inside the Soviet zone of control. Any access is essentially going to be at the grace of the Soviets. And in the aftermath of this, there are several organisations that are created to help facilitate this. Examples of friendship that are going to help good governance of the occupied zones. Yet what the Allies want, and the Allies, including the Soviet Union at this stage, of Germany is very different. And that extends right to Berlin. There is Morgenthau, the American, suggested the idea that perhaps what they should do is just render Germany's industrial base down to zero and turn it into an agrarian state. They should flood all the mines, basically prevent it from ever being able to wage war again. And so the industrial heartland of Germany there comes under threat. Of course, what the Soviets are also doing is pretty heavily plundering everything that's not nailed down, or in a lot of cases what is nailed down, and loading it on trains and sending it out. So whilst the Allies and the Western Allies are talking about rebuilding Germany, the Soviets are pretty much plundering everything out of it and limiting that as well. So there's always going to be friction around this too. To move into Berlin, obviously what the British want to do there is set up their occupation zone, begin their system of governance, and it becomes this incredibly attractive place. I will grimace slightly at the watermark on that particular slide from the place over the river. But old habits die hard. What Berlin therefore became is it was, as much as Barney was saying, this was a city where events happened to it, and the people often didn't have a huge amount of control over what was happening to it. And in many ways, they had different sort of forces of occupation put upon them. And really, in sort of a historical trend, the Allied occupation was no different. And in Berlin itself, the systems and the structures were very different from what they would be in West Germany. When West Germany essentially ended its occupation in the 50s, West Berlin very much remained under military occupation and did so really until the British actually left in 1994 and began to hand everything back. But already what Berlin is seen as, this was the capital of the Reich. This was the main effort of the war that had been through all along. And people wanted to go and see it. People wanted to walk along it. And it became another opportunity for this melting pot, but from a military perspective, where people would rub against each other. And I mean, my interest in this has always been about how people and individuals sort of see great geopolitical events. Because, your average service personnel in 1945 into 1946, 1947, they didn't really greatly understand the geopolitical struggles that were taking place. They were quite far away from the Sicilienhofen, Potsdam, and the conferences. But they were going to have to deal with this on the ground, and they were going to have to see it. And they were living in the devastation of Berlin. Not only were they therefore going to occupy it, they were going to requisition what they needed. Berlin itself, much as Iain, you said, had been smashed to the ground.
Well, I was just going to say, this photo is from 1952, so this is 5 years after the war's ended, and you can still see how badly damaged the Reichstag is, and the reconstruction hasn't begun.
And there was this big question about what they were actually going to do with the Germans who lived there. They were occupying the ground as part of this symbolic front in the Cold War and occupying Germany, but the debates around what they were actually going to do with the Germans and the Berliners rapidly shifted and was different. And you can read the accounts of Berliners as well who noticed these differences between what the victorious Allies, how they behave in these areas. And also you can see that the various powers have their rules of non-fraternisation and stuff. And for the British, you can see the soaring rates of VD proved that non-fraternisation was really non-applied. Despite having a scale of punishments. But and there's this really strange conversion in the relationship between the British and the Germans, which is, for years the British have been trying to essentially smash the Reich, get to Berlin, win the war. From 1942, especially with the advent of heavy bombers, the Lancaster in particular, Berlin becomes a target, the big city just to hit again and again and again. At the start of the war, the idea of bombing of people's cities had been sort of something that wasn't going to be done, and both sides were afraid to engage in it, because it invited retaliation. And yet that's what's taking place. And yet once they're on the ground and once the war was ended, and people saw what Berliners were having to put up with, in particular, we talked about you talked about the ruins. It's very hard when you haven't got to heat rooms and buildings when you haven't got coal, let alone when you haven't got any windows or doors. And the winters of 46 into 47 in particular was incredibly harsh. And so you begin to see that at the very basic human level, yes, there is some enduring resentment. Yes, there is a sense that those most responsible for the crimes have to answer to them. But there's a huge amount of pity just at the basic human level that begins to exist. And then there are the more global events that really force this coming together a lot more. So, this slide here from the airlift, and the famous, that is an American aircraft as well. But, when the Soviets sort of tested the Western resolve to stand up to them, to sort of say, well, here you are deep in the Soviet zone. How much do you actually care about Germany? How much do you actually care about what happens here? And how much are you thinking about the next confrontation? The German blockade, they essentially sealed Berlin off closed the road, the rail, the canals. But one thing they didn't close were the air corridors for a variety of reasons. There's this really strange thing throughout this whole period, actually, that runs right up until into 1989, of this idea about why we might be enemies. There's no reason we can't be civil, and there's this idea that you don't want to overstep and seem to be overly aggressive. Stalin, of course, not being a most subtle person, was trying to essentially either force a confrontation or force the Allies to back down. And so with the airlift, this was very much part and parcel of that, and no one thought they could do it. In fact, the Allies didn't think they could do it initially either. And yet, once they'd started, it began to work and it escalated. It began a major point at which they were going to supply the city and keep the city going. And the thing that sometimes people forget about the airlift is it wasn't just so much about supplying the Western garrisons in the cities. It was about supplying Berliners as well. And it wasn't also just about flying stuff in. It was about bringing people out. So people that needed hospital treatment that they couldn't get in the city, for example. Particular people that needed to get out, refugees. All of these were being brought back out of Berlin. And, RAF Gatow, which had obviously been a Luftwaffe base before, the Allies the British were landing up to 1,000 planes a day. They were developing all kinds of new and novel ways of bringing supplies in, bringing salt in for, obviously clearing the streets throughout the winter. They were using Sunderland flying boats and landing them on the Wannsee, in the Havel. And they used Sunderland flying boats because they were designed to land in the water, so they had anodized skin. So the salt would have been corrosive to your Hastings, your Dakotas, your Avro Yorks, etc. But a Sunderland would work really well. And I think overall, the most significant thing to remember from the airlift is both, one, the incredible effort it took, but two, this was an incredible effort designed to a country that you've been effectively trying to reduce to rubble only previously before. In fact, you had many pilots whose last experiences over Berlin had been dropping bombs, and here they were flying a humanitarian mission in. But also, it's this incredible impact it had not just on the relationship between the Allies in Western Berlin, but also in Western Germany itself. You can see this in how people in the British zone of occupation, in Hamburg, in Hanover, in Bielefeld, how they responded to the British, seeing this in the news, seeing that the British were actually going to this effort to keep West Berlin free. That brought everything together. And in many ways, it had a completely counterintuitive effect to what Stalin intended.
Well, and it kind of drew the line as well, as in what the Allies were prepared to do to make sure that the agreements that had been made, not written down, but they'd been made at Potsdam, that it would be a four-power run city from the end of the war and until, I suppose, that they had got a reunified Germany. And as Peter was saying, obviously, as we progress through the end of the 40s and into the 50s, you then have, by 49, the creation of East and West Germany as sovereign states. Definitely West Germany as a sovereign state. We hadn't recognised East Germany as a sovereign state by then. But where I'll pick up now just for a few slides is where we're on the road going through the 50s towards the creation of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, and which is what I talk about in my book, is to the average East German now living under the regime that they're in, and I'll talk about a few of the main players that were running the government by then, with Walter Ulbricht, who I'm sure many of you know. To the average East Berliner, looking on what was going on in his own city and looking at the disparity of what was going on in terms of reconstruction and what was available to the populace. I have these two completely divergent slides. So this is the Kudamm, which I'm sure a lot of you remember. And so obviously by the time of the mid-1950s, Marshall Plan's already in full effect, is probably finished by 54, 55, in restructuring, helping to rebuild all the economies of Western Europe, and none so more as West Berlin too. So yes, it's an Allied military garrison, but they're actually starting to completely rebuild, reconstruct, renovate West Berlin as a city fit to live in. So if you're the average West Berliner, this is what you'd be looking at. You've got a very normal scene of a normally well-run capitalist city, I suppose. The lights are on for a start. There's consumer goods to buy. It's an exciting nightlife, newspapers to buy. And it was a young city too. Whereas obviously if you're in the east, this is just off one of the main thoroughfares that had been renovated by the East German government on Stalin Alley. This is just off it, but maybe about 2 streets away. And I specifically chose this photo to show you well, this is still the state of the city. And in some places, right up until 1989, this was still the state of East Berlin in some of the suburbs. Because, as Peter was saying, because the Russians had stripped the country bare of its industrial infrastructure, it would take years for that to be replaced and to be rebuilt to where they could actually have an effective economy that could deliver the goods that their populations were expecting. And so all the way through the 50s, probably from, I haven't got a slide for it, but from 1953 onwards, when you've got what was called the intra-German border has now become a hard border. So now you've got the proper Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill famously made in his speech a few years before. That's an armed border, armed guards, quite impossible. You'd have to be very lucky to get through that border to get into West Germany itself on sovereign territory. So the vast majority of East Germans who were fed up for whatever reason, could be economic, could be political, who wanted to leave and start a new life in the West, they were pouring into the loophole that you saw on the map earlier was the West Berlin, the Allied sectors in West Berlin. Because like any city, like the city we have today, all of you have come from somewhere. I imagine quite a few have come from London. You'll crisscross the city, whether you're going to a meeting, a presentation like this, the doctors, shopping, or your job. Berlin, even though it was under the four powers up until the war, was very much the same. As long as you had the right pass, if you were checked, if you didn't, which many Berliners weren't, you could crisscross the city at will, whether you were walking, whether you were on public transport, or whether you're on your bicycle. And so that allowed a loophole that if you were very careful in how you were advertising what you planned to do, you'd take the barest essentials and you'd cross into, unmolested usually, into the Western sectors from the Eastern Soviet sector. And so of a population of nearly 18 million in East Germany, which they kind of started off with, 2.1 million had left by August 61. And that's huge bulk of the population. And of that 2.1 million, 50% were under 25 years of age. And the vast bulk of them were from the professional classes. And even though, and again, I've researching the archives and you read the East and the West German press at the time, the East German government would have you believe these were just one-offs. These were people that would just, they were malignant in their society anyway, good riddance to them. But the real story was it wasn't just one-offs and one person from a factory or one person from a school or one person from an architect's office, for instance, would leave. The whole offices were leaving. There's on record, if you look in the archives, there is, for instance, this whole GP practices would close overnight. So they'd shut for business at 6 o'clock, not tell anyone, and then all of them left that night and they'd be coming to Berlin to cross into the sectors. It was happening in factories, it was happening in schools and colleges, lots of different types of business, engineering works, etc., etc. So this was the argument that was going right the way through the 50s and up to August 61, where by the time Stalin had died and Nikita Khrushchev was now first secretary of the Communist Party, the de facto leader of the Soviet Union, that was the pressure he was under from the East, because he knew, much as the Americans have this domino theory and that's why they entered Vietnam, to the Russians they believed sincerely if East Germany was allowed to fail as a socialist experiment, and as Peter was saying, it's the buffer zone to the West, if that was allowed to fail, then like dominoes, Poland would fall, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. So it was in their interests to try and maintain this balance of power. So again, I've just shown you this slide. This is how easy it was. This is going from the French sector into the Soviet sector. You might bump into a couple of policemen who might be too busy to even check your papers. And this is what made this city so porous and easy for East Germans to get through. So now I'll quickly go through because I know time is racing on. These were the three architects of what was called Operation Rose, the building of the Berlin Wall, the first barriers of the Berlin Wall. Left to right, the man with the goatee beard and the spectacles is Walter Ulbricht. In the center is Erich Honecker, his first Minister of the Interior, but he was the architect who implemented Operation Rose. And then on the right-hand side, a rather nasty piece of work, Erich Milker, who ran the state security apparatus pretty much from the get-go in the mid-50s all the way through to 1989, 1990, when he was arrested and charged with the various crimes his organization had committed. These are the three guys that would implement it. And so August 13th, weekend, lovely warm day like we have today. Well, warmer, I would argue. A lot of Berliners were in the hinterland of Berlin because they'd have places to go and stay for the summer, or they'd have allotments to garden, or they might go swimming in one of the lakes or walking in one of the woods that surrounds the city. And it was specifically chosen this day because they knew the population would be relaxed. Their attention would be diverted because they'd be wanting to enjoy themselves. And this photo, what you have here is the kind of Dad's army of the East German government, a little bit more deadlier than our Dad's army. They're armed with Soviet-made submachine guns and backed up, you can see in the background, with regular East German troops in their armoured cars and tanks. There was about 25,000 militiamen, factory fighting workers they were called. They ran the whole length of the barrier that was going to be built throughout the city, which was about 60 to 70 kilometres long. But then they also were on the barriers around the hinterland of the western sectors, because you've got to remember, they weren't just building a barrier through the centre of the city to block off the western sectors. They were hermetically sealing them in, so they were building barriers around the sectors as well. And there were the only two motorised divisions. They were elite divisions, but they were only two the East German government had. Two divisions made up of roughly 4,000 men apiece each, 200 tanks, 200 armoured cars, and one division was centred in the centre of the city to oversee the safe construction of the first iteration of the barrier, and the other one was obviously on the hinterland. So obviously, if you're an East Berliner and you're waking up and you're wondering what all this noise is about, which has started at about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, you see all these thousands and thousands of troops and militiamen pretty much guarding their own construction workers, not just guarding them, but making sure these construction workers don't run off themselves. It was a shock to everyone in the city. The East German population wasn't expecting it either. And so, as I talk about in the book, and we're going to whip along, the first iteration was just barbed wire and cement pillars. It wasn't a wall. It was the East Germans taking that first step of challenging the Allies to see if they could get away with it. And clearly they did, because within probably 6 to 7 days, they started building a proper wall. And what I talk about in the book is a lot of this was known to the Allies. They knew in dribs and drabs that the information was coming in over probably from mid-July all the way through to when the wall was built. East Germans that were escaping through Berlin, right up until the day the barriers were built, were telling stories of all this construction material that was lining roads outside the city, of these hundreds of trucks, construction trucks that were lined up as well. Something big was happening. And then obviously the two motorised divisions that would be in the city and around the city when this happened, they were monitored by the Allies in West Germany, noticing that they're on the move, they're going into the city, something's happening. And so some of the people that I interviewed, they all thought this wasn't a surprise to them. It was obviously a surprise to the media, and it was a surprise to the East Berliners and the West Berliners themselves, but to the actual Allies, it wasn't. So here we have again, it's a basic map showing you how the wall was built, and the length of it is over 150 kilometres by the end, and you can imagine how much money that would cost right up until 1989. Millions and millions of pounds in East German currency. You had over 195 streets had been blocked off, whether they went across the city or whether they're going out into the hinterland, as I was saying. All the crossing points, there was over 81 crossing points that had been in existence. As I showed you from the photo, they were very open crossing points. You could just walk straight through. There was a sign telling you which sectors you were in, but they were crossing points nonetheless. They'd now been reduced to 12, and the only one, which is why Checkpoint Charlie is so famous, that was the only one for the international garrisons and diplomats and members of the international media. That was their place to cross. Other checkpoints were for specific members of the community, whether you were from West Berlin or whether you were from West Germany in Berlin and you wanted to cross into East Berlin. There were specific checkpoints you had to go through. And that's how they now funneled and monitored the mass of humanity that there would be by 1989. But in the first few years, not many people were allowed to go through. And then obviously, as we all know, we all know the terminology of the death strip. So on the western side, which is why I've put that photo of the children looking there, this is the first proper version of the Berlin Wall, just breeze blocks with barbed wire on top of it. But on the other side, the East Germans were now beginning to create what would be the death strip, because they knew that they couldn't allow the housing that had been so close to where they'd bisected the city, where their barriers now were. They couldn't have it there because it was just easier. Again, a lot of you may have seen the old film footage of various people jumping out of their windows because they were lucky enough that their flats overlooked the Allied sectors, even though they now had the barrier right by their building. And it was as well, it was cynical and systematic that they knew that the amount of money they were going to spend on this barrier, the amount of money they were going to spend on the border troops and police that were now going to guard it, they needed to give them the best chance possible to detect, apprehend, and if they had to, shoot to injure or kill anyone trying to escape through from east to west. And that's why they started clearing housing, and that's why they then started developing what we had by 1989 was this is how the wall now looked, the barrier. And it's very dystopian. My children are 15 now, and they're both learning about the Cold War. And I talk my way through this diagram, and it does kind of blow their mind and captures their imagination of you'd literally have to be Superman or extremely lucky to even attempt or try to get through this barrier on the surface. And that's why there's, again, you might have heard it, the Tunnel 29 podcast on BBC. That's where East Germans were going. They were either going underground, the majority of them were now trying to tunnel underneath this thing, or they were taking their chances on trying to construct gliders, very basic aircraft, or balloons. One of the last fatalities of in 1989 of trying to get across the Berlin Wall was in a makeshift, very homemade hot air balloon, which malfunctioned, and the guy shot up about 10,000 feet into the air in the dead of night. Luckily, the family he was carrying managed to get off, and he was the only one there. And then somewhere over West Germany, he almost made it to the West German border, but he'd obviously crash landed because obviously by then he'd run out of gas. But it was tragic, and I think that was about October 1989. That was the very last fatality. But Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I will also say as well, there are some wonderful accounts, and alongside this sort of overt hostility, and that's one of the most amazing things about Berlin, is they've built this wall, and it's aggressive, and the people are being killed trying to cross it, and yet there's this sort of enforced level of civility that exists between all the occupying powers. And again, because the stakes are so high, Berlin is by this point the place of potential confrontation. You know, yes, the Cold War is being waged elsewhere. We know about Korea, we know about Vietnam, but this is really the place where any kind of direct confrontation between the Allies and the Russians may happen. You have all these structures that are designed to help people be civil. And so much so that there's actually three different sort of aerial escapes that land at RAF Gatow. If you remember the map, RAF Gatow is well into the west of the British sector. And actually at Gatow there is no Berlin Wall. There's a chain link fence, and the other side of the chain link fence is a Soviet division designed. And the Soviets say, "Oh, we didn't build a wall here because we thought it would look nicer." And obviously, no, it's designed because it's a chain link fence because you can just drive through it and occupy the airfield really quickly in the case of war. So it's all very threatening and aggressive. And yet when there are 3 occasions where people land at Gatow to defect and escape. And the British are required to take the aircraft apart and send the aircraft back. And then the East Germans ask for the fuel back as well. They can't get the people, but that's what they want. And the British do it because they sort of have to and maintain these sort of elements of civil. But obviously the garrisons that are in there are absolutely marooned deep inside. And yet they're a really important figurehead for all the different nations and the alliance between them and the West Germans. And, you know, they hold their own parades. They have their own activities. We know about Brixmas. And if you don't, it's in my book, it's in Ian's book, it's in the exhibition here, so please do go and have a look at it. And, you know, we've also got these sort of very strange rituals as well, because, as I was saying, you know, there's this sense of, well, we may be at war, but there's no reason why we can't be civil. And one of those, I don't know if you want to jump on a couple of slides quickly, is Spandau Prison. Now, Spandau Prison is where they hold a lot of the Nazis who are tried at Nuremberg and the ones who aren't executed, including Hess. And Hess is a long-term resident here. But the 4 powers all take turns in mounting guard. But this is in the British sector. So when it's the Russians' turn, the British drive them in and let the Russians take guard. And when there's any kind of medical emergency, doctors from all four powers have to be there. So occasionally, if Hess is hospitalised, they'll bring in a Russian doctor and bring him in deep inside the British sector in Spandau as well. And in fact, there's a Soviet War Memorial in the Tiergarten, which, again, the British end up allowing the Soviet guards to come and sort of stand guard over and honour, but also protect it from the West Berliners who are trying to vandalise it constantly. And so you have all these strange things, despite the fact there is this huge level of hostility.
There's an interesting story about the Spandau garrisons when they were swapping over. Hess was obviously there for a very long time, and over the years, as you would do in a prison if you're an internationally famous prisoner, they'll look after you to a degree, and you will get some benefits. So he was really into West German League football, and he used to watch a lot of matches, but not when the Russians were in charge. They used to switch it off. He wasn't allowed to watch TV. He wasn't allowed to have many luxuries that the Americans, the British, and the French would give him.
And but you have all these things in place well up until 1989 in the end of the occupation, and it's one of these things that made it so fascinating for service personnel who were there, because obviously they took part in it. There was even the ritual of getting to Berlin, the Berliner train, going up the Autobahn from Helmstedt, where if you went too quickly, you got done for speeding by the Royal Military Police, but if you went too slowly, the Russians came looking for you to figure out why. So, you know, and this was all before cruise control, so this was proper monitoring the speed. You had obviously the flying into Gatow as well. And, you know, the British and the Allied garrisons are there purely at the grace and favour of the Soviets, and they knew that. But it made it incredibly exciting. Within that, there's some incredibly amazing facilities as well. The British are based in the Olympic Stadium and everything that goes with it. So, you know, there's a lot of other places where, as a service personnel, you can go swimming in a pool, you know, in an Olympic pool in the 70s, let alone one behind the Iron Curtain.
Bases, it was by far the most popular. And we all really wanted to be there, because it was properly funded, because we couldn't be seen to look quite as scruffy as or as some penny pinching as the army and the line was.
And the West Berliners paid for it as well, which was really nice.
Yeah.
So it was enormously exciting. It was very depressing going over into the east, going over Checkpoint Charlie, but equally incredibly educational. And things like commanding the train. It's my first jobs in the army was to command the train up into Berlin. It was probably one of the most sort of moments in my life that's stuck with me most. As it's wet behind the ears, sort of straight out of university, suddenly going through that extraordinary barrier of wow and death strips and into Berlin, and sort of suddenly realising the world perhaps wasn't that cosy place I'd imagined it.
So we're running out of time, so I'll be very quick. So this is November 1989. This is a very under pressure press secretary for the East German government, Mr. Schabalski. He'd just come back from holiday, and he was presented with the paper I found in the archives. This was the famous memo that he misread or didn't understand, basically. So when he's supposed to be talking about the bureaucratic red tape he was going to present East Germans with for allowing them freer access through the checkpoints, he kind of he did. He blurted out that they would actually have free access of travel, and it starts tonight. It starts immediately. And obviously you can see all the microphones there. And this was a classic case of someone has been tightly, rigidly controlled all his adult life in the East German Communist Party, follows orders to the letter, and now he's in an international press conference where he's just not expecting anyone to ask him any questions, because that's not the done thing. And so as soon as he said that, obviously a massive questions were asked by the international press. Well, when is this happening? What are we going to do? And he just blurted out without thinking what was going to happen. And obviously within hours, it was open season at the checkpoints. And I capture this in the book. And again, what you've got here is you've got the commander at one of the checkpoints there. And I interviewed the commander of the checkpoint at Checkpoint Charlie on the evening. And he was, even though he's diehard supporter of East Germany, still thinks what they did was fantastic, wish it was still back there. He was very angry and cynical about the lack of communication, the lack of command he'd had on that evening. Literally, no one answered the phones, and that was up and down the checkpoints until it was too late. And by then, you've got a mass of East Germans at the checkpoints, and what does the commander in charge of his armed troops do? Does he either go for what was called the Chinese solution of Tiananmen Square and start opening fire on people, which is what the East Germans, especially the new regime in charge, once Honecker had been deposed, they weren't going to go for that, or I'll have to let them through. And that's why you've then got the inset photo of a lot of East Germans just wanted to travel, East Germans and East Berliners just wanted to come into West Berlin for a day out. They knew they had work the next day. And a lot of them I talked to said the same thing. They weren't coming through with suitcases full of belongings thinking my new life's about to start. They were just interested. And a lot of them just wanted to buy fruit and chocolate, because that was the things that, again, even if you're living in the capital city of East Germany, you weren't buying those kind of things you weren't allowed to, or you didn't have access to. And then very finally, these are the three men that I say that they were the right men in the right place at the right time. These are the three commandants of the Allied sectors in 1989. From you got Major General Haddock, the American, real tough artilleryman, had been in Vietnam, suffered no falls. I've been told by several people. He really had a very strong stance against the Soviets, especially the East Germans as well. On the right is Major General Francois Kahn. Again, very, I've interviewed him, very tough, hard man. Had fought in Algeria, had fought in Vietnam against the Viet Minh. And then in the center is Major General Robert Corbett, who I interviewed extensively. And again, I think he just had a cool head in a very pressurized time. And a very small anecdote was, Peter had already said, you've got these Russian monuments that are inside the Allied sector. And one of them was the Soviet War Memorial, which to the Russians, quite obviously because of the amount of blood they'd shed capturing Berlin in 1945, they'd lost about 80,000 troops, suffered over 500,000 casualties. This monument to them is sacrosanct. It's sacred soil. It still is today, I would imagine. And it was allowed that there would be a small garrison would be allowed to always guard the monument. They'd have to drive through the British sector. So obviously on the night that the checkpoints have opened, a lot of West Berliners now feel very free to go right up to the fence and try and get in. So that small garrison was almost locked and loaded, ready to repel boarders. And that's when Robert Corbett got the call to say, can you get to the Tiergarten? They're going to invade the Soviet garrison there. He got there with the West Berlin police who surrounded the facility. He then went in with an interpreter, had all the Russian troops stand around him in a circle. And he said, I don't know what's going on. I'm finding out just as you are. But all I can guarantee is you're in my sector. No harm's going to come to you. Guarantee it. And you could see they all visibly relaxed. The officer in charge of the Soviet sector shook his hand. They gave him a guard of honor going out. And then he was driving to the next emergency that he had to handle in his sector. And that's when he had this huge mobile phone, because remember, it's 1989. And the phone rings, and it's the main command at NATO in West Germany saying, what the hell are you doing over there? And he said, what do you mean, what am I doing? And they reiterated, something's obviously going on. He tells them what he's been doing at the Tiergarten. And basically, a line of communication that had been the main line of communication from the Kremlin through to the Allies, Stalin had closed down after the Berlin airlift in a fit of pique, and it had never been opened again. And it opened within an hour of Robert pulling off this action at the Tiergarten. And it was the head of Soviets, basically the head of the Warsaw Pact, specific message for Robert saying, the Red Army will not forget what you've done for this day. And he was flabbergasted, obviously. And then he obviously forgot about it because he's got to get on with things. But when I've been down to his house in Dorset, he's got this huge cupboard. And he said, let me show you something. He opens up the cupboard. And it's full of Soviet memorabilia. Swords, generals' hats, really expensive vodka, medals, all that kind of thing. And he said, I get presents every year. Every year, even to this day. He said, they just keep sending me presents because they still remember what I did. And I think that's as you were saying, there was civility amongst the four powers. Might not have been elsewhere, but it was in Berlin, I think, and that proves it. So, folks, I hope you've enjoyed our whirlwind trip of Cold War Berlin.